Hi, this is Jake Gorst, the producer of the new film New England Modernism, and you are listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guile. Pass the popcorn. Today is Architecture Movie Day. Joining us are three documentary filmmakers bravely capturing architects and architecture on film. Making these movies is an incredible labor of love. It takes a tremendous amount of work and time, often years. You're fundraising continually. Production is expensive, even when it's done on the cheap. And the financial reward at the end of all of that? Well, let's just say you could do better working a couple of months under the golden arches. That's why these folks are our heroes and heroines. We'll talk to Louise Lemoine of Beka and Lemoine, Denise Zmekhol, and Simon Mark Brown. And now, no stranger to the Big Mac himself, your host, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Thanks, Tom. If you remember the old TV jingle, it's 2 all-beef patties, lettuce, cheese, pickles, and onion on a sesame seed bun. Now, I'm leaving out one key ingredient, the special sauce. This high-level, classified condiment, probably as sacred to Ronald McDonald as the 11 herbs and spices are to Colonel Sanders, really does make that burger taste pop. McDonald's introduced the Big Mac in the late 1960s to compete with Bob Big Boy's highly forgettable double burger sandwich. That fight was a quick knockout, and the Big Mac became so popular that according to Wikipedia, it's now a global symbol of American capitalism. The Economist uses the Big Mac Index, and I'm not making this up, as a reference point for comparing the cost of living in different countries as it's so widely available. Some of you may already know what's in the special sauce, but if you don't, in 2012, McDonald's chef Dan Kudrow revealed in a YouTube video that it's mayonnaise, sweet pickle relish, and yellow mustard with vinegar, garlic powder, onion powder, and paprika. In other words, it's Thousand Island dressing.
Yes.
Just buy a bottle of Kraft from the grocery for your next burger, and voila, you have the Big Mac. You have hamburgled the secret formula. And by the way, in 1983, author William Poundstone hired a lab to analyze Kentucky Fried Chicken's 11 herbs and spices. Turns out there were only 4.
Really?
Flour, salt, pepper, and MSG. The real secret is that instead of frying, it's all done on a pressure cooker. Is your mind blown? You are welcome. There are lots of instructions for special sauce and KFC chicken on YouTube. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle Square Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Palm Springs, Malibu, Los Angeles, and Toronto.
Famed documentary producer, writer, and publisher Louise Lemoine grew up in Bordeaux, France, and studied art history and cinema history at the Sorbonne. She is a partner with Ila Beka at Beka and Partners, experimenting new forms of storytelling about how buildings influence daily life. Their films include Tokyo Ride, Barbacania, Gary's Vertigo, Xmas Meyer, Cool House House Life, and of course, The Infinite Happiness featuring Bjarke Ingels. Welcome, Louise.
Thank you. Hello. Very pleased to be here with you.
Louise, before we talk about architecture, what's Venice like these days? I read they're trying to cut down on the massive tourism, especially with the cruise ships.
Yeah, mass tourism is a constant issue to deal with in Venice. So the city looks for ways of protecting this city, not only from the issues of tourism, but also from the ecological threat of water rise. There is this plan of reducing the number of tourists by introducing a sort of entrance fee.
Oh.
But it's not done yet. It's in the air. It's been in the air for a long time. Let's see if they will apply it.
Did they fix the problem of the flooding in the canal? They built some massive billion-euro project to try to control the water. Is that working?
Yeah, it is. Actually, Venice undertook a disaster in 2019. There was this historical high tide. We did a film about that. And since then, the city made this major project named Mose work. And it does. There were very few days of flood since then. But, it's a fragile system which costs so much to make it work. So all Venetians are still in the doubt that it will last for long. But let's hope.
Yes, let's hope, because it was one of the biggest public projects, I think, in Europe at the time to make these giant underwater louvers that would keep the water from coming towards the city.
Exactly. The thing is that, it took years and years. And so from the early days of that project, the issue of rising water is worse and worse. So the problem is that the time of development of such big projects and the faster evolving issue of ecology. So that's the struggle to deal with as the water still rises.
The first of the films that I ever saw from the two of you was about your father's house. It was called Koolhaas House Life. And it's just the most interesting film because as a person who is not an architect, I started watching it and going, what is this? Is it a documentary? Is it a comedy? What's going on here? So tell our listeners who've never seen it, what's it about and how you came to film it.
It's interesting that you say that it's difficult to understand what object you're looking at, because I think it's something that defines all our work. We are always in between lines, in between disciplines. I'm not trained as an architect, neither as a filmmaker. Ila was trained as an architect, but not as a filmmaker neither. So let's say that we like inventing forms and ways of presenting ideas. And that's probably what made our work so special and different. This film, Koolhaas House Life, was the first time we collaborated, Eli and myself. So it was also sort of the magic of an encounter of the two of us. And the film tries to recount the daily routines of Guadalupe, who's a marvelous lady who used to work in this house as a caretaker. But she is from Spain, and she has an incredible humor. She is a bigger-than-life character. So she really leads the film with such irony and a very irreverent humor towards architecture. She was working in this house for more than 10 years. So she knows the place perfectly well. And through the film, you don't go through a proper architectural reading of the space, but through the questioning and the daily routines of a housekeeper. And so what's the issues that are raised or what you look at is really at the scale of when you look at space through these questions of how you maintain spaces. And this creates a sort of gap between, these iconic representation of architecture, creating a certain mythology around these buildings and the real daily life of those places. And so I was extremely interested to reveal that gap between representation and reality, because being able to live for some years in this building, I had really the sense of that sort of very strong contrast.
Besides Guadalupe, was anybody else living in this house at the time?
Yes, still a family house. My father passed away 20 years ago, unfortunately, rather soon after the completion of the house. He lived there for a few years, but then my mother still lived there. And this house has also a public activity in the sense that very soon after completion, it also became a listed monument in France.
Oh, wow.
And so it's open to the public in certain days of the year, and there are a few events happening there. So it's a house that from the start always had this tension between private and public life. So that's why the film starts with a public visit, with a group of people visiting the house as a monument. And then suddenly the group leaves, and then you enter into the real intimacy of the daily life.
You and Ila are definitely the most prominent filmmakers for architecture in Europe, if not the world. You have a long list of fans, and the most prominent publications are praising you all the time. You did a film on one of our favorite architects, Bjarke Ingels.
He has a signature sound with
Yes,
us.
a little soundbite called The Infinite Happiness, about one of his buildings. And your most recent film is called Rehab from Rehab. What is that about?
So this last film, it's interesting that we've been talking about our first film and our last film, because in some ways they are related, for me at least, sort of underneath. Because as you may know, my father was severely handicapped. The house in Bordeaux was made after his accident in order to also offer a more livable context for him. And so I grew up in a very hospitalized environment. I spent my childhood in rehab centers and was very much into these questions of handicap and very reduced mobility. So when Herzog and de Meuron proposed us to collaborate for their London exhibition at the Royal Academy and to work on the building they built 20 years ago in Basel, we were really thrilled. I think it was really for me a great opportunity to come back on a remote past for me. It was not only to make a film about an extraordinary building, but it was also to dig into very deep and personal memories. So this film deals with the question of handicap and how architecture actually can actively contribute to the healing of patients through the quality of its spaces, materials, and environment at large. And it deals with these subjects through stories of patients. So it's only on the side of patient that the building is seen and discussed and understood.
What is different about the architecture in this building from a typical medical rehabilitation facility?
It has nothing to do. I think if you had the chance to visit this building, you would hardly understand at first that you are in a medical facility. And that makes the beauty of it because, I think this was a real challenge for the architect, but I think this building comes out of an extraordinary encounter between the director of the hospital and Herzog and de Meuron, who really thought a new definition of what a hospital could be. Their effort was to transform preconceptions of spaces of care in the sense that you don't necessarily need for such a hospital aseptic spaces with neon lights and signage all over. I think they were extremely concerned about the emotional impact of space on patient. And they really understood how efficient, how active a qualitative space and a welcoming environment can be on not only the sense of well-being of patients, but also on the improving of their treatments, let's say.
Like a therapeutic space.
Definitely. And this can be read on various layers in the sense that you see in the film that sometimes the building itself is used for therapies, like the stairs. The building has important stairs in the center of the lobby, but it's not only like a space of representation or a social space, but it's really an active therapeutic space that is used every day by patients who learn again to walk the stairs up and down, up and down. So all day you see this is an active space. The pool is the center of this building, which is one of the most photographed spaces because it's extraordinary. The pool is also one of the most central therapeutic spaces of the care center.
It's beautiful, and in the promotional materials for it, there are lots of photographs of the pool.
Exactly. Yes, it's quite unique. And I think the beauty of that place is that every element of this building adds a level or layer of subtlety, of sensoriality to pragmatical needs. So like a balcony, it's not only a balcony to open a window. The balcony is a space of pleasure. All the beds of the patients who cannot stay on a wheelchair, for instance, can be put out to get some sun and some wind and to feel the air. When, for months you are stuck in your bedroom and cannot move, this is absolutely important. In each bedroom, above the bed, you have this invention of a sort of bubble window, which allows patients to have a view of the sky and of the moving clouds above your bed when you are immobile for months. And this level of details in bringing a sense of movement, the impact of senses when you are not able to move yourself is quite amazing. And the film very much investigates that.
Couple of comments that have been made about it. This subtle and delicate film powerfully demonstrates that when you have a disability, you start to see space differently, and space becomes infinite. It raises the question to what extent architectural space can positively influence people's lives. The film is Rehab from Rehab, and their website is BekaLemoine.com, which is BekaLemoine.com. Thanks for joining us, Louise.
Thank you.
Denise Zmekhol is an award-winning producer and director of documentary films. She's drawn to stories of disenfranchised people and communities, including cultural preservation, environmental stewardship, and social justice. A native of Sao Paulo, Brazil, Denise's studio, ZD Films, is based in San Francisco, where in 2019 she was named one of 15 Bay Area filmmakers to watch. Her latest film, Skin of Glass, has already won several jury awards at festivals in Mill Valley, Rotterdam, and Spain. The film tells the story of discovering that her architect father's most celebrated work, a skyscraper, was occupied by hundreds of homeless families. So I can't wait to hear more. Welcome, Denise.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to talk to you about Skin of Glass.
Denise, before we talk about the film, I'd like to ask you about one of your other films called Children of the Amazon. It's just a fascinating story. You were trying to track down indigenous children in the Amazon you'd photographed years earlier. What was that all about?
Yeah, I was in the Amazon many times during the late 80s, beginning of 90s, and I was witnessing a lot of change that was happening in the Amazon during that time. There was a road that was built in the 60s during the time we had a dictatorship in Brazil, a military dictatorship, and they were trying to bring progress and development to the Amazon without acknowledging that there were people living in the forest. So they were just opening these roads in the middle of indigenous people's home inside the forest and causing a lot of deaths, stress, and they're getting sick and dying from cold and pneumonia and diseases that they didn't have before. That happened in the 60s, but, it was an ongoing process of destruction of the forest and almost like an ethnic genocide because a lot of tribes disappeared from the map after the road was built. In the 80s, I was doing sound or assisting other filmmakers, and I was photographing on the side. And I was very passionate about the children of these communities. And I photographed them. And 15 years later, I moved to California, and I was printing those photos of the children. And I was like, oh, my God, what happened to these children? So I was curious to go back. And one of the children that I photographed, two of them were the children of Chico Mendes, an environmental leader who was killed in late 80s. And I remember he had asked me a favor to go back to the Amazon and film his funeral, which was pretty shocking because he was being threatened by the big landowners in the Amazon because he was able to stop the paving of the road near the forest home where the rubber tappers were harvesting latex and lived almost like the indigenous people in the forest. And then I just felt like, oh my God, I owe someone a favor. And I went back to find the children that I photographed 15 years earlier.
And did they welcome you back?
Yeah, they welcome back, and the children were very small when I photographed them, and of course, they didn't have photos of themselves when they were kids, so they were very surprised to see the photos of themselves, and sometimes they wouldn't recognize them because they never saw photos of themselves.
Wow.
And they were kids, so the other kids would recognize them, and the parents would recognize them. So then I had a chance to tell the whole story of, the road being built many, many years earlier because, you are here, but who are you without your history? So I had to go back many, many decades, even 100 years, to tell the story of those people before the road was built and the consequences of that road. I was filming 3 communities, 2 indigenous and 1 rubber tappers, who are a mix of indigenous and Portuguese and sometimes even African, Brazilian,
Uh-huh.
And in the beginning, they were fighting against each other because the rubber tappers would just show up in their lands and start building houses and harvesting latex. But, they weren't destroying the forest to do that. So in the 80s, there was a movement to create an alliance among themselves so they could both, the indigenous people and the rubber tappers, fight against the deforestation of the Amazon because they realized they had the same struggle,
The deforestation of the Amazon is a known tragedy. I guess I didn't realize that the rubber tappers were victims as well.
Well, yeah, for sure they were, and they fought back, and many of them were killed as well. So, the 80s was a very intense moment to be at the Amazon, so much was happening, and yeah.
Your new movie, Skin of Glass, talks about a building, a skyscraper, that your father, Roger, designed in the early 60s, and by 2000s had been occupied by another indigenous community, squatters. But let's start with the origins of the building. How did that building come about, and who was the client?
My father had a client. His name was Sebastião Paz de Almeida. He was one of the richest men in Brazil at the time. He had a holding of companies, and one of the companies he owned was a glass company. And he commissioned this building to my father. He said, I'd like to make a building to be the headquarters of our companies and the glass company, and I'd like to have a building made of glass. So at that time, he only had the transparent clear glass. So they had to bring glass from Belgium, that had more protection against the sunlight. You're building a glass building in the tropics. So you needed the glass to have some protection against the sunlight. And it was just a very huge project. The building had a lot of new technology that now, you see a lot of buildings made of glass. But at that time, in 1960, 61, was, almost...
cutting edge?
Yeah, super cutting edge. And that building actually was one of the first buildings to have a 3 facade of glass. There was buildings that were made before, very few in Brazil, that had 1 facade of glass with the technology called curtain wall design, which is having the glass detached from the structure of the building, right? So it was very unique and needed to be built with a lot of technology. Yeah, very cutting edge.
So what happened to the building over time to get it to the point where it was overtaken by squatters?
Yeah, the history of how, we got to this point in 2015-14 when the building was occupied by homeless people is in Skin of Glass, the film, right? So I tried to bring the building as a character. So I tell my personal story, reconnecting with my late father, who I lost when I was 14. And then I tried to find out what happened to the building over all these decades, So the building was built in this time of hope and optimism in Brazil, and we're just exporting architecture to the world. And right after that, we had a military coup that lasted 21 years. So during this time, the owner of the building lost the building to the state banks, which had financed the building. And he was one of the people who sold materials to help build Brasilia, the new capital, which was done by Oscar Niemeyer. So he lost a lot of contracts with the government because they consider him, he wasn't a leftist, But, they have some documents I found, he was financing the student movement, the leftist student movement.
Which meant that he was falling out of favor with the dictators.
Yeah, he started being persecuted by the dictatorship and the military, so they stopped giving him any contracts. And I think, he couldn't sustain the building and his companies, and he lost a lot of money, so he had to give the building back to the state banks. And after that, the federal government used the building to have headquarters of the federal police. And the federal police during the dictatorship, they were doing a lot of different work. They were making passports, but they're also they have a lot of censorship happening with journalists and artists and a lot of persecution. So it was kind of a very dark moment in Brazil. And during this moment, the federal police had their headquarters inside the building. After they left, the building was abandoned for many, many years. And that's when the housing movement was growing in Brazil, and people were seeing all these empty buildings in downtown. And they felt like, we have in this constitution, in the Brazilian constitution, that we have the right for housing. So how come these buildings are empty with no social function? The building they have to have a social function. They can be forever empty. So they start occupying these buildings and making them their home, which is not totally legal, but, the government now is trying to figure out a way to find a home in these empty or abandoned buildings that sometimes are private, sometimes are public.
So it sounds like these people are what we might call squatters?
Yeah, it's similar in a way. I think squatters, in Europe and in the U.S., they're more you see more people, artists, right, squatting in empty, abandoned houses or buildings,
just
right?
about anybody that needs a roof over their head.
Right.
Exactly.
There's a skyscraper in Caracas in Venezuela called the Tower of David. It's 45 stories, and it's full of... Are you familiar with this building?
Yeah, I saw some photos. It's amazing. And it wasn't finished, right?
I don't think so.
Building.
No. It's funny because it was featured in a couple of episodes of the Showtime series Homeland some years back. Where I think they actually went down there to film it there. And it was like the ghetto vertical.
Exactly. Yeah, so it is kind of squatting in a way. There is a deficit of housing in São Paulo alone. There's a need for 300,000 families, have no homes. So, and the housing secretary said in the film, it would take 100 years, to get everyone a house.
Yes. Your film has had an amazing reception, Denise, at all the festivals it's been at so far. What do audiences come up and tell you at the end? How does it affect them?
Yeah, it has been amazing. Actually, I premiered in Europe, and I was very curious to see how people would feel about the personal story, in this film, because nobody knew me there. So that was my chance to see if it was really working to tell the story from the personal that goes organically to the social and political. And I realized that, it was very good to have the personal story in a way, because I think I didn't want to make a film that was only made for, people who are on the left or progressive people, because they know that story. They know it's important to have, housing for people that are homeless, and they care about the homeless and they care about displacement. But I thought having my personal story of loss would help them open their hearts to understand and see these people in a more human way. And I think it really worked. And I was very happy to hear people saying, wow, it's so beautiful, it's so emotional, it's so impactful. A lot of people use that word, it's so impactful. And they were really very open to see this movement, to see these people, the homeless people, in a very different way. At least that's what they said. They felt they had more empathy.
Compassion.
That was the goal. Compassion, because, their story is a story of loss as well. People, they are homeless because they lost their home. They're not necessarily born homeless. A lot of homeless people are adults.
Did not choose to be homeless, that's for sure.
Yeah.
The film is Skin of Glass, and you can learn more about Denise and the film at zdfilms.com. Thanks for joining us, Denise.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
In 1951, New Zealand architect Peter Mark Brown went into practice. Heavily influenced by the works of Richard Neutra, Marcel Breuer, and Walter Gropius, the multi-partner firm expanded into the forefront of local modernist architecture and New Zealand's first international architectural conference. Mark Brown's son, filmmaker Simon Mark Brown, shot more than 1,000 commercials in his decades-long career. His documentaries include The Secret Life of John Rolls, The Sun Came Out, and A Bit Mental. And he directed the 2017 comedy drama The Catch. His latest documentary, Brown vs. Brown, mixes family and architectural history, studying the legacy of his dad, Peter Mark Brown. Welcome, Simon.
Hello, nice to be with you.
Simon, before we talk about the movie about your dad, I'm curious about a project you did called A Bit Mental. What was that all about?
That was a very entertaining chap came to us who was suffering from depression, and he wanted to leap in New Zealand's longest river and paddle it on a blow-up mattress, a lilo, and said, would you like to come and film it? And we had nothing else to do, so we followed him for 2 weeks as the poor bugger literally lay on his stomach and dog paddled whatever it is, 260 kilometers of river, raising awareness and money along the way. So, yeah, he made it very chafed and a lot fitter, and it sort of fixed him. It did fix him. So,
really? Well, that's great.
Yeah. So most of my film projects have had some kind of sort of social bent to them. I quite like doing, after so many decades of making TV commercials, one needs to balance the soul occasionally with longer form projects of merit.
A heartfelt project?
Heartfelt projects, yeah.
So was he really on an air mattress? It wasn't like a blow-up canoe or something?
He was on an air mattress, and on some days the wind was more than he could paddle, so he'd be going backwards.
Oh, so the wind was in his face.
Sometimes the wind was in his face.
Was this a twin, a queen, a king? What size mattress?
A very small single.
Oh, my
They're
goodness.
called lilos, Lilo. We grew up with them as surfing.
Were there points where he had to hit rapids? Or, I mean, I've seen The Lord of the Rings. You have some rivers out there.
Yeah, he went through rapids. He also went through about 6 power stations, which was the most interesting thing. So you have to swim up to the dam and then take the emergency chute. Very illegally, shall I say. We didn't get permission anywhere. And he'd whiz down and rejoin. We did go through about 8 lilos because they would puncture
they would
quite
break,
easily.
I guess, right?
So
Yeah.
where can we see this movie?
It's on a American website called Altavod, ALTOVOD, Altavod, and it's called A Bit Mental. I think it's still on there, yeah.
I got to look that
Okay.
up.
Otherwise, keep an eye on my website, republic.co.nz. It might appear there soon. But it's very entertaining. Yeah, it's funny.
It really is. I was looking at it. Now, your dad, architect Peter Mark Brown, he passed away when you were a teenager. But before he died, he tried to dissuade you from studying architecture.
He did.
Why was that?
He died when I was 17. And when I was 15 and 16, I was thinking about university and careers and all that sort of stuff. And I liked drawing and art. I wasn't huge on maths, but I probably would have been okay. He just said, don't do it. And when you see the film, it will make a bit more sense. I think it was just a combination of clients who can be very tricky, as you all know, council regulations, dealing with tradesmen, as we all know, has its own stress. I think his very last house, he had quite a lot of creative pushback on certain things. There were clients who understood they wanted a beautiful modernist house and then probably didn't really let him get on with it, which is a standard kind of thing. So I think that was probably the last straw, to be honest.
Do you think that this advice was maybe informed by this last experience more than his overall experience?
Oh yeah, I think it was that. I was building and building, and I think the firm was getting bigger, and he wasn't good at confrontation and stress. And suddenly they had
Oh,
45 or 50 people in the practice, and it had gone from him and his original partner Alan Fairhead and Ron Sang, the brilliant young Chinese guy they took on, the first partner. And then I think it just got bigger and bigger, and the work had got bigger and bigger. And I just imagine it was all just suddenly like a huge factory, and it was just too much. It was all too much.
Well, it just gets to be very stressful managing personalities, particularly creative ones. Once you get over about a dozen, it's tough.
I remember one story. I must have been about 12, and he'd sourced a beautiful piece of New Zealand timber for a front door that he wanted to be 12 foot tall. It was the big striking feature at the front of the house that pivoted. And when he turned up on the site, the builders had cut it off at 6 foot. The normal size door. And I think that was just one of the 8 foot. That was one of the, I remember that quite clearly, him coming home that night. So I think it was just a combination of all that sort of stuff.
Your movie, Brown versus Brown, is really a love letter to your dad. Tell us about who the other Brown was.
Well, so my name, I've got this ridiculous name, Simon Mark Brown, which I've had to spend my whole life explaining when I go to hotels or get on aeroplanes. They can't understand it. And in the late 40s, early 50s, there was only one architecture school in New Zealand, which was in Auckland. And the head of school was an English chap called Vernon Brown, who was also a modernist, sort of modest little black and white houses. And my father was Peter Brown. So all my life, people have said, "Oh, is Vernon Brown your father?" And I've gone, "No, Peter Mark Brown." And we were always told, and even having made the film, I still haven't had it totally verified, that he changed his name at architecture school from Peter Brown to Peter Mark Brown to not be confused as Vernon's Brown. And Dad was an internationalist, as you said earlier, heavily inspired by Richard Neutra in particular. And Vernon Brown was a regionalist. So there was a group of these regionalists who thought New Zealand should have its own vernacular based on the English sort of cowshed, which was a sort of nonsense in a certain way. And so there were these two sort of clashing schools of thought about where New Zealand should go with modernism. I mean, they were both freeing us, as they say, from the shackles of the English cottage, but they had totally different views. Although when you watch the film, you'll see that there's more similarities than there are differences. So essentially, it's Dad as Peter Brown breaking away from his teacher, Vernon Brown.
Yes.
And Vernon Brown's gone on to be the sort of acknowledged grandfather of modernism in New Zealand. And the internationalists, many were Eastern European and Austrian and German and Polish and Czechs. They haven't really had their dues. So I started this project 24 years ago, and it was just really to go and get a list of Dad's houses, go and look at them, see how many owners were still there, which was amazing. There were probably 8 to 10 people still in his house after 40, 50 years. So I just compiled a bit of stuff, but I just couldn't get an angle. There's nothing written about my father. There's no video of him. There's just, they never took photos. There's one photo of Peter and Alan, his partner, one photo standing on the steps of one building. That's all I could find. And so it languished. 10 years later, I sort of picked it up again and thought, oh, maybe I can just do the houses, and did a bit more research. And then I parked it again. And then last year I was looking at a house supposedly by Vernon Brown, which turned out not to be. And I got the inspiration. The film needs to be about this conflict of regionalism versus internationalism.
And what is regionalism?
So they thought we didn't need to look overseas for inspiration to Japan and Scandinavia and California. We could find it all in New Zealand. But really that was just nonsense, because what they were looking at was the English cowshed. So they were still taking inspiration from another piece of architecture, just an older piece of architecture. So my father, who was 19 or 20 at the time, and his group, they said, no, wherever the best architecture is, that's what we want. So they love Scandinavian and Japanese and especially all the modernists that went to California, So that was their thing. And these other guys were they wanted modest houses for the everyman and all made out of timber. And Dad wanted to build it glass and steel and concrete. And
yeah, sure.
Proper, right Neutra materials. But you couldn't get those things in New Zealand after the war. You had to put your name down for a metre of concrete. You had to wait for glass. The biggest glass sheet, I think, was 8 foot by 3 foot or something. So that they were limited by what they could get. So it was just this clash of ideology, really. They were saying, we don't need, New Zealand's a bit like this. We're very insular, we're at the bottom of the world and we think we punch above our weight and we don't need that overseas stuff. We can do it ourselves.
Which independence.
I know, but it's silly.
Now, despite your dad's advice, you did get an architecture degree, right?
Yeah, I did. I did a midlife crisis one. I started at 49 or something. I just thought, look, let's just do it. So I went and had a meeting with the head of school, and he was a lovely chap. And I said, well, what do I need? Do I need a portfolio? And he said, you know what? We know who your father is. We love mature students. You can come. And that was my interview. So
Was that a good thing or a bad thing to be?
Oh, it was fantastic. So when I started, it was a 5-year Bachelor of Architecture and a 7-year Master's. And I thought that sounded a bit scary. I could almost commit to the 5 years. I mean, I had a wife and 2 children and a film business still going, so I was going to try and juggle all of that. And I remember on about the 3rd day, there's a knock on the door during a full lecture, and this chap comes in and goes, good news, due to worldwide international alignment, the Bachelor of Architecture is now going to be 3 years. It's going to be compressed into 3 years. And I came home going, I got 2 years off for good behavior.
That's fantastic.
So it suddenly went from 5 to 3. And I just knew right then, I can definitely do 3. So I think out of the 110 students, I was probably the only one that never missed a single lecture in the whole time. I just loved it. I was like a kid in a candy shop, sitting there having lectures on Brazilian modernism and Le Corbusier, and I just loved it. Yeah, so it was one of the best times of my life.
Your film, Brown versus Brown, is on the festival circuit now. Where do you expect the public is going to be able to see it? Are you looking at any of the streaming services?
We're very elite, us filmmakers, you see. We try to have theatrical release first. That's the kudos, get it in as many theatres. And then it dribbles down and then it comes out on video on demand as your last thing. So in New Zealand, it was we have one architecture film festival, and it was in that in May. Well, that's actually how the film got made. The day I was standing on that veranda and realised it was a film about regionalism and internationalism, I went straight in to see the woman who arranges the Racine Film Festival and said, would you be interested in a film about blah, blah, blah? And she said, hell yes. Not only are we interested, we will open every one of the 8 cities with your film, because we've never had a New Zealand architecture film in the festival in 12 years. And I said, great. And she said, I said, there's only one problem. I haven't started making it yet. And that was in October. And I had to deliver the finished film in February. So literally I just had to go bang. And I shot a lot of it myself. November, December shooting, January, February cutting. And I delivered the DCP, the digital cinema package, to the festival literally 3 days before it started. So it had a great run in that festival.
Did you have any footage of your father that you could use?
Nothing. I had some crappy old photos. I had some really bad old VHS video of the original interviews I'd done with people, which was lucky because a lot of them had died. So I've used that in the film. What I got taught 30 years ago is you can have a film with crappy pictures but good sound, but not crappy sound and good pictures. And it's completely true.
Yeah. As a sound engineer, I'm all for that. Yes.
Yes.
It's totally true. You can get away with any old pictures if the sound's good. So I had nothing. So it was just a base of interviews, and then I found photos, and then we have this fantastic archive at the university called the Shepherd Collection, and that's just some bureaucrat from 1948 to 1975 kept every scrap of modernist newspaper and magazine. So that was an amazing source. So it had this great run in New Zealand, and it actually set box office records at the festival. And then I've just had a small theatrical run through New Zealand of about 16, 17 theatres. It's actually still going in a couple of theatres. And then I took it to Newport Beach Film Festival, which was a great experience. But my exciting thing is it's in Palm Springs Modernism Week. I'm hoping to meet and talk to distributors about where next for the film.
The film is Brown versus Brown. Thanks so much for joining us, Simon.
No, thank you. It's been great.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, And by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 20,500 significant modernist houses, and access 4.3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with guest research by archivist Kelly Policelli. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I will be back soon with another Back to the Movies edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.
Support your local architecture documentary filmmaker.